Okay, and welcome to the new webinar that we're basically going to go over the different aspects of Scaleform that are used inside of CRYENGINE. I have right here a Notepad++ document, and let me zoom in a little bit. So, if we look at the top thing, we can see that it says the Scaleform introduction, which is basically what we'll cover in just a second. And this will go over the version used and the Flash version required. Now, version used means the Scaleform version, and then of course the Flash version. We can talk quickly over which games in the Crytek history have shipped with Scaleform, and then we can also dive into, well, this is really the meat of it. We will dive in and create a Swift vector file, so we'll only take vector graphics, and then we will export or compile to a GFX file, and then we will basically expose this through FlowGraph inside of the editor. Now, the other path that we have to kind of cover is we will create a Swift image file, which means we will take an image, and if I go and open this, let's go ahead and let's see. So I have the CRYENGINE logo, and this is a PNG, and we will attach this to the Swift file, and we will look at what we have to do in order for it to compile properly, because it will expect what is called a direct draw surface, or a DDS file, because otherwise your texture memory may get too high and it could result in the entire thing crashing. So once we're done with that, we will look at using functions to expose variables to dynamic text. A good example of this would be where you have recently we had a game called Flappy Void, and we took the score and we wrote that out to a game token, and game tokens are just basically variables that exist in FlowGraph. And then we took this dynamic text box from Flash and basically exposed that or laid it over the top of the game, and then you were able to drive dynamically the actual score from the game into the text box, which would be the Flash UI. So you can get a lot of versatility through exposing this function, and that's the next thing that we'll cover. So on row 7, as we can see, it shows that we are doing triggering button events for menus in interaction. This is something that I'm not sure has been covered too well. It is basically showing you how to do the out, over, down, which is the standard Flash setup for a button. And we won't be using any other presets. We'll be building our own through a movie clip. And then we will be driving the action script through each keyframe. And we'll be giving those keyframes names, and then that corresponds to the action. So likewise, when we look at it, we go, okay, if you click this event will call something. And it's as simple as that. So we'll look at basically calling a action. It may be that you load a level. It may be that you have a light come on and off. You can do a lot with button events inside of menus, and then you can just set up your in-game menu, you can set up your settings, or you can set up your initial menu. So I think this would be a good introduction to how Scaleform can be used, and then maybe we can look at it in later webinars, like doing switch, so you can basically set up your settings across different specs. If you wanted to have 1, 2, 3, 4, you would be able to do switch right down. Actually, some of the stuff we will start covering at the end of it if we have time, which is the Game SDK Flash assets, and then we can look at those, but it may be something that we have to cover in a future video. So I'm going to go ahead and close this, and I have some slides here. If you've seen my other videos, I have one that says the Scaleform introduction, and it kind of covers the topics that we're going to show today, but it doesn't actually get into too much of the creation. So from the beginning of this, you can see that it has the Flash logo. Now, Flash itself is owned by Adobe, and it has kind of morphed into a new program called Adobe Animate. Now, it's important that we understand how Flash exists, because we can't use Adobe Animate in our pipeline because Scaleform is not written for that. So if we look at Scaleform, we can see up top, it's basically going from a bottom to the top approach here. It says that CS6 is required, and it uses actionscript 2. Now, that's the reason that CS6 is required, and AS2 comes with CS6, and it's something that you can install if you have Creative Cloud, If you go into the older versions of Animate, you'll see that it says CS6. It actually is not something that Animate actually compiled out and they sent an application. It's just it will start installing Flash. Now on each side, I have two pseudo applications. I'm not sure exactly on the validity of their of them still being available, but it's important to note in the past that community members or indie developers are basically using Victorian Grotto and also Flash Develop, and these are kind of free versions of Flash that you can compile out to Scaleform in. Now, keep a note, like I said, I'm not sure exactly how much they are up to date, but they are options from the past. So I'm not going to cover this, or this. I think that we have basically covered the initial slides, and then we can get into the actual meat of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and launch up Adobe Adobe Flash. Acrobat's just got that red lettering as well, so it kind of just sucked me in, I guess you can say. So let's boot it up. It's actually booting on the other screen. So this is Flash, and like I said, it's Flash CS6. And we can see that inside of this, you can create a new AS3 or AS2 file. We actually want to do actionscript 2. And to start us off, we will simply click this button. So this is my canvas, and I think, what are the dimensions? 550 by 400. Let's go ahead and change that to something that's a little bit more manageable. So let's do 1080 by 1920. So this is your pretty much your standard HD format. And if you come up here in the top right, you can say fit to window. So this is basically our game. You can imagine here's our HUD, here's our crosshair, and we're moving through it. So we kind of have our canvas where we want it to be in terms of the aspect ratio. And the next thing I need to do is change my FPS to 30, because 30 is just the standard for animation. Whether you're using Flash or even keyframing a character, you're going to want it set to 30 FPS. You can see right here, it already has the script of AS2 or actionscript 2 available. The next thing up top, we can see that we have the target, which is the Flash Player 11.2. Now, I, generally speaking, only go up to about 10, because historically this is what people have compiled out to. Even some of the materials way back in the day have gone back to 8. So 8 to 10, I think any of those Flash players will likely work. So the first thing that we need to do is let's go ahead and just name something like vector, because we just want to get a vector piece of artwork out of Flash and into CryEngine. Like, this is our goal. So what can we do for this? Well, I think the easiest thing to possibly do is probably just getting a vector shape. And I'm going to be picky on my shape, and I'm going to go down into the Poly Star tool. And then inside of this, we have options. So I just really want to have a star. And 5 points is pretty good. That's exactly what everybody expects. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill it with something that's as close to the CryEngine blue as I can find. And holding Shift down, I'm going to constrain it and draw it out. So I need to make sure this is not wonky or crooked, as they would say. And so I'm going to hold down Shift again, and I'm just going to rotate it until I get the 5-pointed star exactly where I want it to be. So it's good enough for right now. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Let's see. Nope. There we go. Holding down Alt, I can basically constrain it to the center. And now I have my 5-pointed star. So let's go ahead and save this out. So we were going to save as. I'm going to go to my data drive, and I have Game SDK in here, and I don't have a folder. And historically, what this folder existed as, and you can create a new one right now, is called libs for library. So I can go inside of there, and I am going to press Control-Shift-N, which is a shortcut for a new folder, and I'm going to label that UI. And then inside of there, I'm going to label U as Flash Assets. And now what I'm going to do is name this Flash webinar. So now that I have this saved out, what I can do is go into my publish settings, and I actually want to change the Swift to publish out to here. So now that I'm able to, you can see it's relative, so it's basically the dot dot and the slash means that it's moving up one folder and saving it from there. You can also get rid of the HTML wrapper, there's no reason to get it, and we just want to have Flash. So let's click OK. I could have clicked publish back there, but I like to be fancy, and you can press Control and Enter, and this will publish your star, or it should. So I'm going to press Control S, and let's jump out of there. So now what I can do is I can go to my game SDK, I have my libs, I have my UI, and now I have my Flash webinar, which if I double click, this is the Swift file. So the Swift file is pretty small, and there's the Flash file. So I'm going to press Control N, and what I want to do is I want to go into the tools, and you'll see that there is a GFX export, and GFX export corresponds with Scaleform. Now, I don't know why they didn't just call it the Scaleform exporter or the Scaleform compiler, but the format is GFX, and this is what we'll use. Now, this one is very tricky to set up. It is something that has so many settings you might get overwhelmed. Actually, it doesn't. All you have to do is drag your Swift file over it, and now you'll notice that there's a GFX file inside of your UI directory. Now what I want to do is, this is where we're going to reference something from Game SDK quickly. And the reason you do this is because we have demo stuff set up, and you can just simply reference quickly how stuff is set up, like the crosshair. So we can go ahead and just move that to, let's move it to here. What I'll do is move this to a new file, and if you were to look, you would see there's something called UI elements, and these UI elements are basically how your element or your file is exposed to Flash to work. So let's go ahead and press Control Shift N again, and what we'll do is we'll do UI elements. So if I go into the UI elements and I paste the crosshair, we don't really want the crosshair, but we can use it as a basis. So I'm going to go ahead and open this inside of Notepad++. So choose another app. Let's see if I can find it. Move it on down. It is okay because it's already open. So let's go ahead and just drag it in. So this is something where, as you can see, we've already commented this XML. It's nice and lovely. And I think the scaling is fine. So ignoring this, these are all comment lines if you're not familiar with scripts. In the top it says the UI element's name, which is crosshair, which is kind of like the category, as it says. So you might find stuff, other certain scripts like a HUD or a menu, and these won't have a parent category. So we can just call this one Flash webinar. And then down here is actually the name of the element, which will be exposed inside of FlowGraph. So we'll call that one Flash Webinar GFX, just so we know that it's actually doing it. And then the next one, what we'll do is we will reference our UI element, which is right here. So I want to cut, paste. So Flash Webinar is what we want to call it. And then we want to save this as Flash Webinar. Okay. So let's go ahead and minimize this. So now we're ready to jump into Game SDK. And I'll just pause the video while we wait for it to start up. Okay, now we have the Game SDK project launched. So what we want to do is we want to create a new menu, or new level. So we'll call this Levels Flash Webinar GFX. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. Let's go ahead and just create the default height map resolution and click OK. And then we'll wait for this to pop up on screen. So now we have this. And the next thing that we want to do is we want to create a flow graph to be able to execute our display. So what I want to do is I want to go to the empty entity. And these are technically the new entities, but you can attach a flow graph if you right click on them. So I'm going to create the flow graph, and let's call this one GFX vector. So I will have created that, and then let's go ahead and, I have flow graph right here. If not, and you don't see it, you can go to Tools and select flow graph. And I can notice that this didn't get updated properly, so I'm going to go ahead and close it and open it again. And then you'll notice there's entities, so sometimes it didn't update. So I'm going to do a right click and I'm going to add a start node. And this is basically the game start. And the next thing that I want to do is right click and add a node, and we'll go down to UI, display, and we'll do display. So what I want to do is on game start, I want to show my element. And if I come up here and browse to it, I should see this inside of this listing right here. Like you can see it says Flash Webinar GFX. But I also know that something is wrong in essence of how we set it up. So I have in my libs, I have the UI and UI elements. What I want to actually do is I want to move this right here. So I have my Flash assets, I have my UI elements, and then inside of this I have my GFX and my Swift file. Just so I know that this works properly, I'm going to go ahead and save. And then I'm going to close and just restart the editor. This is just so I can make sure all my scripts are loaded properly. Nothing more. So now with the editor open again, let's go ahead and just do the Flash Webinar GFX. We'll open that up. Okay. So now let's right click and we can enter this flow graph. And if you remember, so entities, GFX vector, entity 1. And what I want to do is I want to find my element inside the listing. So Flash Webinar GFX is the name. I'm going to choose that, and it should show whenever I jump into the game. So to hop into the game, we'll go into game mode, press Ctrl G. And we can see our big blue star. Isn't that nice? So that kind of wraps up the whole vector part. We go and press Ctrl S. And now what we're going to do is we're going to look at using an image with it. So if you can recall, I had the global here. And what I want to do is I want to go into my libs UI, Flash assets, and I'm going to access my webinar. And for the moment, just so it's easy to export, you can just paste it right there. Failed to open document. How dare they? I think it's because I moved it. It's going crazy. So let's try and open that again. Okay, so this is our lovely star. Now what I want to do is I want to be able to add my global image. So my global image can exist right here, or it can exist in the actual assets. Let's go ahead and move it into the assets. And we'll call this one CE logo, since I basically grabbed this off Google. I made it a little white. And now what we can do is we can add this to our library. So we want to be able to import it. So now we have the CE logo, and I can just add this. It's a little big, so I want to be able to scale that down. There's probably going to be some banding, some just general issues, but for the most part, we can just line it up and then kind of get the idea of what I'm trying to teach. So now we have included a PNG, and what I can do is I can save it out. Let's go ahead and go back to the UI. let's go ahead and delete the Swift file, the GFX file. I'm going to press Control Enter. And I can't see that it actually published anything here. So let me go ahead and save this Flash webinar, which is correct. And let's go to our publish settings. So let's do that. We can just do it here. Press Control Enter. And now we have a Swift file. And we, most importantly, have a Swift file with the CRYENGINE logo on it. So this is where something is going to deviate a little bit. And that deviation will actually be in how we use a tool. So we talked about the GFX exporter, and we had used it before. So whenever we use the GFX exporter, if we just drag something in, if it's vector art, it will just create a GFX file. Now, if we have images attached, just like this does, then we drag it over the GFX exporter, we now notice that we have a TGA file that's been generated to go along with our GFX. Now, this historically was considered okay, but as far as you can see, it's like 7,657 KB, so 7.6 meg. This is a lot of texture memory, and this is not what you ideally want to do. So we're going to delete this, and we'll go ahead and delete the GFX as well. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create a shortcut, and this is just how I like to tackle it. And we can call this GFX export underscore images. And if I go into the properties of this, we can actually set the flag on the target for what is called a direct draw surface. So if I look at it, I now have an IDDS. I can click apply, and if I drag this over now, instead of being a TGA, this will create what is called a direct draw surface, or a direct X surface. So if I drag that over and we create the images, we now have the proper DDS format, and it's not nearly as high. So this is why we exactly wanted to do it, because this is more of a runtime texture than a TGA, which isn't performant. So let's go ahead and go back to the game SDK. I'm going to go ahead and pause it and wait for it to load. Now being inside of the game SDK, let's go ahead and open our level. So Flash Webinar GFX. And with this level open, what we can probably do is just jump in and see if it's changed. So now you can see that there is a CRYENGINE logo, and it basically is drawing out on the screen. And this is a simple display, and what we can do is we could, in theory, shrink it down, but for right now, let's go ahead and do resolution of 1920 by 1080. We can make sure the positioning is stretch, and that's where we get these bars. And then if we show it right here, you can now see the clean canvas. This is why we basically showed a 1920 by 1080, is because this is, in theory, what a lot of computer screens render out to. Or it also is something that most HMDs render out to. So you can get your proper screen resolution and quickly render it. So now we've covered the first two bullet points. And we could look at the constraints, but now I think due to time, what I want to do is switch over and look at exposing a function. So then we can expose a string into this, like a text box, and then we can dynamically change the name of, say, buttons and functions, and then you'll be able to create a menu system, which is the core of the concept that we want to drill in. So I'm going to pause the video, and then we will get into the next section. For this next section, what we're going to look at is we are going to expose the dynamic text box to an event inside of FlowGraph, and we'll be just adding it on to, say, this star that we created right here. So what I want to do is I want to grab a text box. So this is the text tool, and what we can do is just draw out some sort of box right in the middle here. If I go to properties, I can see that I have the color, and it's 80 point. Courier new is set, and we can go ahead and do test. We just drag this down just a little bit so it's right where we want it. We can go ahead and just turn off the selectable option, and keep in mind you need to go into embed and make sure that your font has been embedded, and then the export for ActionScript. So just a quick thing that you have to understand. The next thing that we want to do is we want to come in and create our ActionScript layer. So I'm just going to call this ActionScript, and by default there is a keyframe right here. So if I go to the window and then we grab actions, we can start to actually script in our behavior. So inside of test, we can see that we have an instance name. We're going to reference this, and we can just call this one my text box. So my text box is going to have some logic involved. Now, in order to do this, let's just write our own function. So we can write our function and call it like update text. And then in the function itself, we will have a variable. And that variable, we can name a simple my text. And then we basically want to denote that it is a string. So let's go down and create some curly brackets. And if we remember, the instance name was my text box. And so my text box had a property inside of it, or a member, named text. And what we want to do is we basically want to drive that variable, or that setting, through the my text string. So now that I have this in place, I can go ahead and say call it, and we can see update text. And what we want to do is we want to pass in a string, and strings are done by quotation marks. So I'm just going to use my name. And then with all of this put in place, let's see, if I press Control N, what happens is Collin is exposed. So now we have Collin sitting here, and this is text that's completely dynamic, embedded inside of the Swift. And then what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to change this, well, whether it be, like say, a game token inside of the engine to kind of denote a number. So we'll look to drive this, and then we'll use this in, say, like a button sequence for a menu right after this. So let's go ahead and close that, and then I'm going to press Control S. I need to make sure that this is building in the proper place. So this is not, I believe. Is it? Flash libs, UI elements, flash webinar. Yes. And then let's go ahead and delete all of this. And then I'm going to press Control Enter. Make sure we built it out. So the shockwave object. Let's go ahead and go to our tools. And we will export out our Swift file with images. So like we did before. So we're getting a DDS file. And then you can see it's generating the metadata. So let's go ahead and look at our Flash webinar file. Oops. Let me grab Notepad++ real quick. Okay, so with Flash webinar open, we can start looking at maybe a new category. So we had gone over this. The constraints and alignment mode are actually something that we can cover in a bit once we have something inside of the screen. But you saw that it was dynamic, it was center, and it was scaled 0, 0. I also have a image that I can show, which kind of just goes over what does that mean. So scale 0, max 0, you can see this is basically how it would treat it if it was 16 by 9 or 4 by 3. So if you had scale 1, max 0, you would be able to cover this part of the container or that part of the container, or maybe you would just clip it off and then you have black on each side. So it's just something to keep in mind as far as the alignment. Now, what we can do is we can begin to access the function. So inside of this, what we can do is we can just draw up our functions. So simple category, and then we obviously need to close this. Otherwise, we're going to get some crazy errors. And then I'm going to indent it, and then we will start to look at the function name. So the function name, if you recall, was called update text. And likewise, the function name, oops, can't spell today. The function name would be called, actually, that should not be camel text. The function name will be called update text as well. And then we need to add a description. And inside of this would be updates the dynamic text box. And then we can close this. We need to go in and we need to execute the parameter name. So the parameter name that we are targeting, if you remember, is the member name text. And then we will add the description here as the new text value. Next, I want to be able to do a type, and we will just call this a string because that's what it is. It's a name. And then I need to be able to close this, so we will call this function. So if we recall what we just did, we basically made a function, or we basically made the function before, and we'll call this function name update text. The actual function name that we gave it inside of this in the ActionScript was called function update text, so it's just pulling that, and then it's saying updates the dynamic text box. Now the parameter is the member of this actual function, and the member of that text box, it was called text. So this is the new text value, and this is a type of string, and then this is exposed inside of this. So what we'll be able to do is, let's go ahead and save this, and you can see that we're generating asset metadata. I'm going to go ahead and close. Let's go ahead and just save it so we can keep it going. And then I'm going to go ahead and boot it back up. So now inside of this, what we can do is, let's open up our Flash Webinar GFX. And if I go in and press Ctrl G, we can see that we have Collin. It's basically setting that value. It's already doing kind of what we want. And now what I can do is go into the entities. And we want to add a node. We'll go into the UI. We'll go into functions. And with functions, we want to find our Flash Webinar GFX at the very bottom here. Update text. So on start, we want to update this text to say, let's do CRYENGINE. It's just the same thing again. So now let's see what happens if I come in. So you can see it's kind of clipped off because the text box isn't big enough, but you can quickly see how you're able to dynamically change it. So let's do something else differently. So something called a graph token is up top here. I can create a new token. Let's call this one test score. And then I want to assign it to be a string. It's very, very important that you remember what these variable types are. And then what I can do is go into my mission game token. Or actually, what do I want to do? I want to set my game token. So I need to set on game start to a value. And I want to set my token value of test score to be 10. Now this is a quick and dirty method, just showing you how you can execute it, but you can drive variables into this and you can keep score of things quite quickly. So let's go ahead and see if 10 goes into this. Out value call text. We don't want to show that. Let's go ahead and jump in. And now you can see that the number 10 has been printed out. So this is how you can create scores, you can create time, whatever variable exactly you want to permit to be exposed through Scaleform can be done this way. So this is just another setup, and the last one that we'll go over is setting up a button system so you can use it for a menu. For this next section, we're going to actually create a entirely new Flash file because we'll be looking at buttons. And we've kind of expand it as far as I want with these elements. So I'm going to go ahead and just do a new one, and we'll just do this as actionscript 2.0. Keep in mind we talked about doing 1920 by 1080. And then what we want this to be is 30 FPS. So I'm holding the spacebar down. This is a nice little hand scrubber. Keep in mind, I said before, we can fit in the window with this. And what we want to do now is we want to be able to create a button. And you can get fancy or you can just get really generic. I'm just going to go ahead and create a button right here. So if I go in, I can select it. I need to change the paint because nobody can see it. So let's go ahead and just make it a default blue. So now I've got this shape. But this shape, I really want it to be a button. So if I right click and do convert to symbol, I get a icon that comes up here, and it's actually a movie clip. So what we want to be able to do is we want to create a movie clip, and what we can do is just call it like, let's just call it button. So now you'll notice, if we jump into it, you'll see that we're in scene 1, and now we're inside of button itself. I'm going to go ahead and save this before I jump too far, and we'll call this one flash button. Not with an I. What kind of spelling is that? So now inside of this, we have the ability to, let's call this shapes. And inside of that, I can say copy keyframe. So I want to copy a frame, and I want to create just a couple more. And it'll just have the same shape in it. But now what I can do is I can access this, and maybe we'll do a different tone. And we'll go to the last one. And we'll access something like this. So if we go through it, you can see that we now have kind of a change. This is a little too unapparent, best way to put it. Okay. So now we have the shapes in place, and it's very important that we name these. Like the frame itself is basically inside of ActionScript, we're going to say, this is the keyword that you need to be able to know. So the first one, this is the same as buttons. If I were to drag a button in, you would notice that it's called out, over, and then down. And these are just keywords that are across. They're nothing unique to Scaleform. It's just something that we do in general. So now that we have this in place, we can go ahead and add our text box. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer, call this one text box. And inside of this text box, we're just going to add another test. Seems like I hit the mic. So let me go ahead and cover that up. We can get it to white so we can see it. Keep in mind that we want to make sure that this is embeddable. So we need to access this and expose it to ActionScript. And now we basically have the core elements set up, and we're about ready to go into ActionScript. So let's go ahead and just make ActionScript. Oops, Scripto. And for ActionScript, you can bring up a window just like this. So now that we have the ActionScript open, we need to be able to drive a couple elements. Specifically, the instance name, we need to name it like we did before. So we'll go ahead and just call this one button text. Keep in mind it was dynamic text. It may not work because if you have this. So now we need to drive down the logic of the ActionScript. And it's quite easy to understand. At the beginning, we just don't want anything to happen. So we need to just put in stop. So now that we have it on stop, we remember that we have several functions, and the functions that exist inside of Flash per se, and the most important one is called an FS command, which is the on pressed. Otherwise, we're just going to use simple Flash commands that basically look at the function and say go to and stop. Go to and stop, go to this frame. So the first one that we're going to do is the on rollover function, and this function itself has its own curly braces. And then, like I said, we'll do go to and stop. And then what it's going to do, I need to make sure that I use proper camel text. go to and stop, and then what it's going to look for is the over. So this corresponds to exactly what you would think it would be. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste this twice. Well, technically more than that. So the next thing that we want to do is roll out. So roll out, and then we can change this to out. And then this one kind of gets interesting because we need to do the press on the down. So on press is actually going to execute an FS command. So this is where the Scaleform command of the button press actually is executed. So the FS command, which is a standard command name for Scaleform, we can do on pressed, which is the name. And then what we can do is we need to look at the button text, and we need to expose that button text. So button.text, or button text.text, that's what it would be, needs to be able to be exposed right here. And then we can stick it in the brackets, we can stick a semicolon in. And so we're basically saying on pressed, take into account the fact that it's gone down, and also expose the fact that the button text can be changed dynamically. And the last one that we want to cover is on release. And inside of this function, we need to just go back to the over. So it's kind of a core loop. The over is just the default state. You're basically on rollout, which is the scrolling over, and then the pressing down. I think this should actually be called hover, but that's beyond the point. So with that in place, we can basically go and let's save. That's the most important thing. And then let's go to our scene 1. And then inside of this, we can go ahead and create more ActionScript. So inside of this ActionScript, what we want to do is we want to be able to look at the different files that we have. So inside of this button, we can basically say this is button 1, and button 1 is this instance. Well, we can look at drilling into this by just doing a small little encapsulation. So button 1 dot button text, which if you remember it was inside of it, dot text equals start. Make sure it's a string, like we said before. And then the next one we can possibly bring over, which is how this works. And we'll call this one button 2. Well, maybe actually I should have it below it. Okay, so button 2. And then I want to access... No! I didn't want that on my button, actually. I want it to be here. So, yeah. Current selection, layer 1, frame 1. Let's do button 1 dot button text. And then we'll say dot text because that's the member variable. And then we'll call this one start. And then we need to be able to close that with semicolon. And then we'll do button 2 dot button text dot text. And then we'll call this one exit. So we'll go ahead and press Control S on this, and we will save it, and we will basically create our Swift file. So you can see it's already denoting, yes, it's start, exit. So pretty cool. I can see that there's some update issues. So go to... I wonder, so it's over, out, down, and then over. So let's... because these are backwards. Stupid me. So out, over, out, down. Okay. So let's try that now. See? It works perfectly. Okay. Let's see, are we getting any output issues? Nope. All looks good. So I'm going to press Control S. We'll go ahead and close this because we're ready to get rocking and rolling. Oops, I don't want that actually. So we need to go into our libs, our UI. Let's go into our UI elements, and we will copy and paste this. Okay, so flash buttons. So what we want to do is we want to open this with Notepad++. Let me go find it. So it should look relatively the same. So we'll change this out with flash buttons. We'll call this one flash buttons. And we will call this one flash button. Which, keep in mind, I can go directly to the tools and compile. And since it's not using any sort of imagery, I don't have to worry about it. So flash button is definitely the name. The GFX. And then we want to start looking at the actual functionality. So inside of this, what we need to make sure are a couple things, like the UI element has a couple things exposed a little bit more, so we can make sure that we have interaction. And that's simply two things called the mouse events equals 1. Oops, need to put that in parentheses. And then the next one is cursor. So you just need to make sure that these are basically active. That's the only thing. So let's go ahead and we can make this a layer 1, so we can make sure that it lays on top of it. And then we will keep the alignment mode the same. So the big thing here is that we have to change these. These are no longer going to be called functions. These are going to be called events. And then the event name. So we're just trading out some of this. It's a lot easier just to do this. So now we have the event name, and the event name, I believe, well, actually I need to open it back up. Okay. So the event name is basically going to be called onButton, and this is just a default event that's triggered. And then the fs command is what we want to track. So let me. So the fs command is equal, if you remember, to onPressed. And then the parameter that we're going to be passing is definitely a string value. There will be no description. Don't really need that for anything. And then the parameter name will just be called name, not namra. So press Control S. UI elements, so flash buttons. Let's go ahead and launch the editor. So upon discovery, I noticed that I had actually not closed this out properly. So I'll just do event and do Control S. Let me go ahead and save that, and then I need to come back in. And we are almost done with the webinar at this point. So now what we want to do is we want to go into our webinar GFX. And let's go into our entities, the button menu, and we'll select our element, which is flash buttons. And then what we need to do is let's first apply what is called an action filter. So inside of this, we need to go to Input, Action Maps, Action Filter. And then inside of this filter, we have something called Only UI, which basically looks at, oh, you can only use this. So on pressed, I want to enable, and on release, I want to disable. So that's pretty clear. Not too much deviation as far as I can see. The next thing that we want to do is go to UI, and inside of events, we'll actually have the on button flash event. And pretty much what we want to say is on event of this, something needs to happen. So I'm going to end up, let's go ahead and just grab one of the legacy light entities, which is easiest. So let's move that up. We'll increase this to like 100 so you can see it. Change the environment editor. I would really like to do more on this topic, I just don't have enough time. So now with this, what we can do is we can add this light, and you'll see that we have the enable and disable. So the two IDs that we gave, I think, were start and exit. So let's do start. I'll have to look at that again, actually. And then exit. So let's go in here. Let's go into our actions. Yeah, start and exit. So on, basically we're saying on event with this, exit, disable, on event, enable. Let's reverse that. And then what we can do is, let's go ahead and use the P key, make sure that we're rendering it. So I can see that I have some events, but it's not letting me click it or do it properly. So what I need to look at is on this. So if those aren't functioning properly, I think it's because partly I'm going to have to make sure that they match exactly the names. So start and exit in full caps. Oh, and also, that's a big part. We need to trigger the name. So as you can see, it's all the minor things. So let's go to Control G, and then I'll do the P key. I can see that I have a little bit, but it seems that it's actually deviated from the constraint. And this could be partly from the resolution and changing it. So if you just have a window resolution, let's see if that matters. Yeah, so it's just basically the window resolution. But you can see exactly how you can have a start and end or an exit. And so you can deviate, and you can, on this event, if we go back to FlowGraph, you can trigger whatever you want. So this is an any event, and this is likewise, you could execute like a console variable if we wanted to be able to make it a different time of day, or you wanted to have Spokey enabled. This is how you would do it. Or you can have an in-game menu. So you've been able to see exactly how you drive the dynamic text, which is pretty cool. So the start and exit, and being able to basically populate and position wherever you want inside of your screen. So this wraps up the webinar. As far as we had a couple of hiccups, but as far as everything goes, we went over basically how Scaleform is, how you use the GF exporter, whether it be images or straight vector art, how we create functions to be able to drive the strings, which we built up on top of with the buttons. But now you have a complete overview on the basic setup of Flash and how you can execute different menu settings inside of CRYENGINE 5. So I hope you enjoy the webinar, and I look forward to the questions and answers that will be following after we finish playing this piece. So I enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed it as well, and I look forward to showing you even more stuff inside of UI and Scaleform in future webinar series.
Achieved with CRYENGINE.